Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? I'm getting back to a normal schedule of sorts, but I imagine I'll need another 3 days of good sleep before my brain gets back to even. Too many late nights, too much stress, and too many days of witnessing misery have taken their toll, and all I want is a vacation I can't take. Now that it appears the latest family medical crisis has been addressed, if not solved, I can try and get back to everything I was doing in February before the car wreck that began this 2-month marathon of madness. Namely, writing stories, recording them, and publishing the damn things while making some scratch on the side. Tune in next week to discover how all that has gone sideways. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 11 of The Black.
With all the lights off and the porthole shade drawn, the room was a tomb. JP shivered and wrapped his legs in the blankets. He normally slept beneath a single sheet with the comforter and blankets kicked off the bed, but that wasn't the case tonight. He should have been sweating beneath a sheet, 2 blankets, and a comforter. He should have been miserable and hot enough to set the room on fire. Instead, he was freezing. The last time he checked the clock, it was 1 a.m. He'd taken a load of acetaminophen, and it seemed to drop the fever a bit. Other than that, the stuff had been fucking useless. Goddamn oil. Goddamn fucking oil. 3 scorching hot showers and he'd barely managed to get the shit off his skin. When AUV-2 surfaced after the rig nearly capsized, he and Belmont had headed out in the Zodiac to retrieve it. Vrabel had only authorized the trip after he canceled action stations, which meant, of course, they had to search for the damn thing at dusk. Although it was painted in yellow and reds, the paint wasn't at all fluorescent. They'd had to rely on the GPS beacon. Catfish had called him on the radio. JP? Yeah, he'd asked as they loaded the Zodiac with the tow ropes. There was a brief moment of silence, and JP knew Catfish was puffing away on his e-cig. Considering how shaken the tech had been after the bubble hit the rig, he wasn't surprised. I'm looking for the reports, and AUV-2 appears to have lost some power to the starboard screw. Can you please check before you hook it up? I don't want to get something even more damaged. JP and Belmont exchanged a glance. Damaged? He asked. You think it hit something down there? Possibly, Catfish said, willing to bet Macaulay was off in her calculations and it ran into something a little more massive than I'd planned for. Maybe too much speed. Roger that, JP said. No, we are mechanics, Belmont said in his clipped accent. How long have you known this man? JP chuckled. Longer than I'd care to admit. He is like a father worried about his children, the diver said. He is at that. In silence, they finished loading the Zodiac. JP made sure to bring an extra bumper just in case they had to secure the 2 ropes to something other than the ballast tanks. He didn't want to tell Belmont, but he was sure they'd have to go extra slow on the return trip. Luckily, AUV-2 wasn't far from where it was supposed to be. Unlike AUV-5, which was always blowing its approach, the damaged robot was a mere 20 meters from its planned descent spot. The problem was the rig had been under thrust for several hours. In all the commotion, Catfish had forgotten to reprogram the AUV to compensate for the additional distance. Once they powered on the boat, Belmont pushed the engine to just 20% below the red line. The boat jumped and bumped against the waves as they headed out into the fading light. JP just knew there were fish below them. Would have been a fine night to go spearfishing. Oh well, maybe later in the week he and Catfish would have a chance. If that was, Vrabel wasn't still spooked about another seismic event. It took them nearly 40 minutes to get to the AUV. When the GPS indicated they were almost on top of it, Belmont cut the engine and they glided past its position. The last of the sun was below the horizon and bruised clouds filled the eastern sky. As they made their slow journey to the south, he could see starlight between the gaps. Belmont dropped the anchor in the water to slow their movement. He looked at JP. You down this time? JP smiled. My turn in the drink. Belmont shook his head. In the drink? What drink? The ocean, he said. It's an old idiom. Idiom? Forget it, JP chuckled. He put on the air tanks and tested the mask. All the gear was working as expected. He attached a powerful halogen light. Here we go, he said and dropped backwards off the pontoon. As soon as he was in the water, JP raised a hand to the mask, found the switch, and turned on the headlamp. A tight cone of white light stabbed through the darkness. There were 2 splashes, and more light flooded the area. Belmont had dropped the 2 portables into the water. At first, JP was blinded. When his eyes adjusted, he realized Belmont had made the right call. The AUV was more than just a dark shape in the water now. The yellow paint reflected the light back at him. He smiled around his rebreather and swam beneath the AUV. When he turned his head upward toward its bottom, his eyes widened. Catfish hadn't been kidding. The starboard ballast looked as though a fish had smacked it with a sledgehammer. The metal around the screw was bent, and there was some damage to its engine. Shaking his head, JP ran his gloved hands over the surface. The metal was pitted from multiple impacts. Something scaly? He wondered. That didn't make any sense. No fish he knew of had scales hard enough to dent and scrape metal. Not like this, anyway. JP surfaced beside the AUV and waved at Belmont. The Ukrainian threw the ropes into the water. JP nodded to him, gave him the OK sign, and then slipped back beneath the waves. He managed to secure the ropes without further disturbing the ballast or the screw housing. The starboard propeller had a bit of something wedged in it, but he wasn't sure what it was, and that didn't matter anyway. Once he finished making sure they could tow the beast, he swam toward the torpedo-shaped robot's front. The scoop attachment was closed, but just barely. A thin trickle of black liquid drizzled out. Covered in the wetsuit, he was hardly worried about getting any on his skin. A chunk of flesh dangled and swayed from the scoop's jaws. Even with the powerful halogen aimed at it, he couldn't tell what it was. It twitched and moved upward. Well, he thought, that's something new. Catfish had caught himself part of a tube worm, and its head might still be alive. JP didn't know they could live without the rest of their bodies, but he guessed it made sense. You could cut certain worms in half and they'd just regenerate. Maybe tube worms had the same kind of biology. JP finished inspecting the ropes and surfaced. Belmont blinked at him. Everything okay? He swam to the side of the Zodiac and lifted himself into the boat, turned off the headlamp, and pulled off his mask. Yeah, the AUV took a hell of a hit from something, but I'll be damned if I know what did it. Belmont's stoic face twitched. Perhaps the worms were hungry. Was that a joke? JP asked. A thin smile broke across the Ukrainian's face. Let's hope so. They towed the AUV back to Leaguer. Instead of keeping the engine near the red line, Belmont held their speed to less than a quarter. It was a long, long trip. The rig was still under thruster power, and while it didn't move very fast, it had put even more distance between itself and their position. JP spent the time watching the moon as it rose over the eastern horizon and slowly made its way into the sky. The waxing gibbous colored the clouds in shades of yellow that accented their dark, moisture-filled hues. When they finally reached the rig, they stowed the Zodiac and raised the AUV using the crane. Out of the water and bathed by bright work lamps, he took pictures of the robot's belly. The damage looked even worse than it had underwater. JP snapped dozens of close-up photos of the pitting, scrapes, and dents on the AUV's ballast tanks and propeller housing. If he didn't know better, he'd swear someone had taken a hacksaw to it. Only something really sharp and strong could have done that kind of damage. He sent Catfish an email describing the damage along with the photos, and then he'd done the dumbest thing of his life. JP moved to disconnect the sample scoop. Because the AUV was in the air and the scoop was directly in the middle, he had to duck under the damn thing. Because he was more concerned about hitting his head than what his hands were doing, he missed the scoop release and instead dragged his hands across its front. The scoop rattled as whatever inside it moved. Startled, he tried to pull back his hand just as whatever was in the scoop managed to bite him through the gap. He leaped upwards and slammed his head into the bottom of the ballast tanks. The world became a shade of gray, punctured by starlight. His finger throbbed and he tried to see how bad the cut was. Through the fog, he made out 2 small puncture wounds. Bright red blood welled out of the holes. He brought it to his lips and sucked on the blood. The taste of copper and rancid castor oil filled his mouth. He spit as a wave of nausea threatened to spew dinner over the metal-grated deck. "You're okay?" he dimly heard a voice say. Swaying a little, he looked over and saw Belmont. The Ukrainian was trying to hide a smile and failing. "Hell no." Belmont's face broke into a grin. "Seriously, you bleeding?" Only from my hand, JP said and held up his swollen index finger. He managed to shuffle out from beneath the AUV. Belmont stepped forward and looked down at the top of JP's head. The Ukrainian shrugged. No blood in the hair, but I think you need to go to the medic. Finger doesn't look so good. JP nodded and regretted it. The mental furniture was doing a bit more than moving around in there. He felt like his head was filled with shattered glass. Screw it, I'll get Catfish's goddamn monster later. Belmont raised his brows. Monster? Tube orb sample, JP said and pointed to the scoop. Damn thing is still alive in there. Alive? Belmont asked and swiveled his head toward the AUV. The color drained from his face. That should not be. Maybe a fish got in there instead. This look like a damn fish bite? JP asked and shook his blood from his finger. Belmont grunted. No, looks like you got forked. Got that right, JP said. Completely forked. At the time, he hadn't known just how true that was, but now that he was shivering beneath a pile of blankets, he knew he'd been poisoned. The damned rig doc was useless. Dr. Subkowiak had hit him with a tetanus shot. While the doc had been disinfecting the wounds, the short, balding man had studied the finger. You sure you didn't hit a piece of metal? The doc had asked. JP had shaken his head. No clue, man, but I don't think so. The scoop doesn't exactly have teeth. More like pincers. Subkowiak continued rubbing alcohol into the wounds. JP ignored the pain. The doctor's fat, pudgy thumbs squeezed on either side of the bites. Blood trickled out, but it was extremely dark. The doc pursed his lips. What the hell? What? JP asked, and looked down at his finger. A black dot of color rode the narrow stream of crimson. What is that? He asked. Subkowiak shook his head. No clue, JP. The white-coated doctor swiveled in his rolling chair and reached for a brown bottle. He pulled off the cap and pointed to the stainless steel sink on the wall. If you would, JP. JP stood up and put his hand, palm up, over the sterile metal. The doctor put the bottle close to the finger and squeezed. Thick, dark liquid poured out over the puncture wounds. The pain increased in his finger, but the blood stopped flowing. The doc reached for a sterile pad and slowly wiped off the excess. He grabbed a magnifying glass with a bright LED attached to it. One click, and JP's finger was beneath blazing white light. His finger itched and then started to burn. He tried to ignore it, tried to tamp it down. He had been trained to do so, but this was different. It felt like someone had stuck a red-hot coal beneath his skin. He pulled the finger away from the light. The doc looked up at him. Hey, I need to... It's fine, JP said. Just give me some antibiotics and I'll go sleep. The doc had shaken his head. That could be poison in there. We need to... Just do it. The lab-coated fat man had shrugged. He pulled out a Z-pack and handed it over. Do you have some anti-inflammatories, Tylenol or something? JP had nodded. Yeah, I'm fine, Doc. He had taken the small cardboard box from the doctor's hand and headed back to his room. He'd swallowed the starter tabs for the antibiotics, several pills to handle inflammation, and then taken a shower, and another shower, and another. Anything to warm himself up. And no matter how many times he brushed his teeth, that terrible castor oil taste wouldn't leave his mouth. He thought about just manning up, putting on a pair of shorts and heading back to the dock. Fuck that. He hadn't been sick a day in his goddamn life, and he wasn't about to let this get to him. JP continued shivering beneath the blankets until he fell asleep. In his dreams, the scoop opened and something crawled out. It was so black, light just seemed to fold into it. It had the barest shape detectable. The thing moved toward him. He was frozen in fear as tentacles of black shot out and wrapped his body in their freezing embrace. His skin melted from his body, and his bones dissolved. In his sleep, he pissed himself. While he dreamed, his index finger jerked to and fro. He didn't feel the bone break or the joint collapse. JP was too far gone to feel much of anything.